Mr. McDermott, does the defense wish to make a closing statement?
Yes,
Closing
Your Honor.
argument? Thank you.
Just a short word about how this works. The state gets to split their argument. So they'll make an argument, I get to make an argument, they get the last word too. Okay, first word, last word, and I won't get to rebut that. That's just the way it is. We accept that. You've all taken an oath, and you've taken an oath. The judge will instruct you in just a minute. Not my words, not their words. The law that will require you to decide this case based on the evidence. Based on evidence. You remember in my opening statement, I told you that the state has got gaping holes in its case. And that the state is going to give you bits and pieces of evidence. And then it is going to tell you a story to fill those in the way that suits them. And it's going to ask you to imagine along with them that that story is true. And it's going to ask you to make a leap of logic at the end of it. From alleged instances of abuse to murder. And I have asked you to follow your oath, to follow the law, and decide the case based on the evidence, not on the imagination. Let's talk about the evidence a little bit. You've been told about the difference between direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. I won't rehearse the story, the lesson. What hard evidence exists in this case? I will submit to you that not one bit of direct evidence in this case points to that man right there. Not one. I'm not saying there's no direct evidence in this case. There's lots of it. There is obviously the remains. There is the manner in which those remains were recovered. We had the head discovered in the street on April 29th. We're not exactly sure how it got there. One detective thinks there was a great rain event that washed it out. Another one says there was a dog. We don't know. And then about a month later or so, they discover several bags in the wooded lot behind the trucking business. Some people call it a junkyard. Come back to that. The medical examiner eventually is able to identify the skull using dental records, dental charts. And notes that there are tool marks, of course, on the body parts. After some time goes by, we also know that there was a search at Christopher's former residence. There was lots of evidence taken from this. The lots of evidence that came from the remains. As we talked about before, there were paint chips in the hair. There were human hairs, apparently not Melissa's. There were pubic hairs, a pubic hair. There was DNA evidence. There were carpet fibers. There's lots of evidence. And you heard the detectives sit there and tell you, we specifically sent this off for testing. Some of it more than once. Whoever's hair that was in there that wasn't Melissa's was also not his. Whoever's pubic hair that was also not his. Wherever those paint chips came from, It was not from his residence. Someone says, oh, it was remodeled. It may have been remodeled, but folks, when you paint over paint, the old paint's still under there. You go scrape a paint sample, you're going to get all of it. None of it matched. There was luminol evidence. It sprayed the entire house, not a drop. And finally, the more modern DNA taken from the bag. You heard Detective Stein sit there and talk about the event where they went out with all the media to the site, looked at the proximity to where Christopher had worked. You heard him testify about the DNA in the bags, and he read the results of those reports. Yes, we found DNA. Yes, there was a viable profile that represented 5 people. Two of whom at least were male. And they submitted Christopher's DNA sample. They went up specifically again to get new DNA from him and submit it for that test. That was in 2022 or so. Christopher willingly submitted. Yeah, he knew the DAs were still investigating him. He didn't run from it when they called him and said, hey, we'd like to get your DNA. And he submits it, and you heard the results of the test. Christopher Wolfenbarger is excluded from being a contributor. Well, that's when we hear this theory about there was a great rain flood event. I gave this page from the weather reports. The National Climatic Data Center for the City of Atlanta in April of 1999. I gave it to Detective Shepard. And you saw him pretend he couldn't. Or I believe it was Don, I gave it to him. And you saw him pretend, oh, I'm not comfortable reading this. This document's going to go back with you into evidence. And you all can look at it. And if there's a single one of you who can't figure it out, I will be shocked. The days go down here, the days of the month, the hours of the day go this way, and at the end, there's a cumulative total of the rainfall for each day. And you'll be able to look at this document and see that on that day, the other deputy who said there was an intermittent mist was correct. There was roughly 1/4 of an inch of rain for the entire day. And most of it appears to have fallen at about 3 o'clock in the morning, long before that had appeared on the road that day. And you can look up the rest of the way, 0.000000000. Detective Shepard, oh, it rained so much that month. No, it didn't. They analyzed the carpet fibers, they could find no match in Christopher's house. So then we're told about the circumstantial evidence. It's interesting to me that you just heard the district attorney tell you all the facts and evidence in this case point to one man. But he's not talking about this hard evidence, is he? Because there's a bunch of that, and not a single bit of it points to this man. All of it points away from this man. But Detective Shepard, or maybe it was Detective Calhoun, one of the two, got on the stand and said, there's only been one suspect in this case from day one. Well, when the results keep pointing away and pointing away and pointing away, maybe there should have been a difference. Maybe you should have asked some more questions of the neighbors or of the family. You heard the detective, the district attorney here tell you. That's how we conduct investigations. We look at the person's life. We want to find out what's going on in their life. They never investigated that family. They never investigated anybody else. records of the test of paint chips for a single other person's house? Where are the records for a search warrant from a single other individual's house? Where are the search warrants getting hair or pubic hair or DNA from anybody else in this investigation? Crickets. Because they want to tell you a story about domestic violence. I'm a supporter of Me Too. Domestic violence is a real thing. You've heard the district attorney tell you multiple times now, this is a case about domestic violence. It may have that question in it somehow. Certainly it does. It is an issue you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to decide how much weight to attribute to those alleged incidents. And you're going to have to decide, as a fact finder and determiner in this case, how it fits into the overall picture. But this is not a case about domestic violence. This is a case in which a man is charged with an act of murder. And the state has not given you one single instance or bit of evidence about an act of murder. They want to get you sympathetically on the board after he tells you, don't judge this by sympathy. But then he wants to tell you all these violent instances, and he wants to embellish them. He punched her. That's not an evidence anywhere. He beat her all the time for the whole year. That's not an evidence anywhere. And they want to tell you that story and then ask you to make the leap to there must have been some act of murder also. What about these instances of domestic violence? We heard from first about the July 1998 incident. Yes, there's a police report. We had a police officer testify. He told you he did not look under her clothing. How could he have known if there were scrapes on her back or backside? He told you that. I didn't look at that. We get home and Norma says, well, I got home with her and she had scrapes all down her backside. Just after she had gotten done telling me that she was wearing blue jeans. I'm not sure how you get scrapes if you fall on the ground with blue jeans on. You have reports from Tina. Tina says she came in there with choke marks on her neck. And there was another guy named Clinton who stood up for her. None of that story is corroborated by anybody else anywhere. The only person who's ever told that story is Tina Patton. Tina says she took Melissa back up to Chris's house on Brookline and confronted Christopher. But Christopher tells Detective Scott in his interview that he didn't like Melissa staying with her sister, because she got her into cigarettes and also was doing meth. Not necessarily that Melissa was doing it, but that he didn't like Melissa around that stuff. Well, I think there would be a confrontation when she brought her up there. We've heard from Mr. Dixon about domestic violence. It is funny to me. You should find it incredible that when he gives an interview in 2003 to the police about Melissa, he does not one time mention abuse, marks on her body, being drugged on the sidewalk, her complaining about her husband. He does not mention it one single time in an hours-long interview. And suddenly, when they find him at the last minute before trial, they find out he's been watching true crime shows about this, and suddenly he remembers this incident where she had bruises and she drove on the sidewalk. The testimony is not credible from the former Waffle House employee and bank robber, Mr. Dixon. You heard evidence from Ms. Cooley, lived across the street. She seemed to be confused about a lot of her facts and details. Testimony was difficult to follow. But she says, oh yeah, I heard screaming and breaking glass over there all the time. There was apparently no glass left in the house at some point. Definitely from that house. Definitely that house where Chris lived. And I know that because that's the house I went in and cleaned. I cleaned all the houses that Mr. Holyfield owned. Who's Mr. Holyfield? Holyfield didn't own that house. You heard testimony from several people. That house was owned by Christopher's parents. Miss Cooley was never in there. I think Miss Cooley's confused as to what she's talking about. Well, I definitely saw a black eye behind the glasses. And then she said a few moments later, I only saw her passing a few times when she was getting in the car to go to the grocery store. Never talked to her, just said hi. Testimony about Saul. Oh, he had access to Saul's home. Well, their memory seems to be just as cloudy and hazy as a lot of people. And this is a 26-year-old case, that's understandable. But I look at the statements that were made, and I see at least 4 different versions of that story that were told. In the original detectives' reports, they said a Saul went missing while Chris worked there. And we thought it was Chris. We blamed Chris. And we never found him. And then later it turned into he stole a saw. And then later they backed off and said, well, no, he asked to borrow a saw, and we never gave it back. You heard them, their own witness, they had to impeach you by playing things that were in audio because they said they didn't even remember saying that. And they testified here that he took a saw, not saying he stole it, whatever. And she didn't even remember talking to me a couple weeks before that, before trial. She didn't remember telling me on the phone that, yeah, he brought it back. My apologies. Circumstantial evidence about alleged conflicts in Christopher's statement. What conflict did you hear in his statement? Inconsistencies, that was the word. There were inconsistencies in Christopher's interviews. And they play for you the interview with Mr. Stott, 2001. And then they play for you the interview with Detective Shepard in 2021. In one version of those stories, in the 2001 interview, Chris tells that the last time he ever saw Liz, she was walking down Lee Street by the MARTA station. And he stopped to pick her up, took her up the road to Taco Bell, right by the interstate. And when they were done talking, apparently she talked about wanting to get back together. He said that was too emotional for him at this point, and he dropped her off back at the train station. And she left back north. Lee Street, Martin Station. How far is that from Christopher's house?